Russell, I guess on the Australian side, you've worked in the education sector here for probably over 30 years, I think it is. What are some of the great examples that you've seen, I guess, in country models that you think of when you think of success stories for Australia?
Sure. Thank you for that. As Carla knows, I'm extremely passionate about in-country and cross-border delivery, so I can talk about this for days on end. So hopefully I'll try and keep this to a few minutes. Obviously, the work that BSI Learning is doing in India and with organisations such as Chandigarh, absolute best practice. So, full marks to all of you on that. And I figured that I probably shouldn't use BSI Learning as the example, given it was BSI's podcast. So I've got sort of 5 examples that I think actually provide, really good, solid examples of what we're talking about here. To me, the standout is actually RMIT Vietnam. And the reason that RMIT Vietnam is the standout is that RMIT Vietnam, with campuses in Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, is now into its 3rd decade of delivery. So that actually means that RMIT in Vietnam is an established long-term institution. It's not just a partnership deal that was done and a few students went between Vietnam and Australia. It's a fully integrated university in the Vietnamese system and it's stood the test of time. And I think that's happened because their model there goes way beyond delivery of education. It's all about building local capacity, enhancing employability, and strengthening Vietnam's own innovation system. The work that the Vietnamese government and why I should do in innovation and how they link that to education and train is just phenomenal. And as I said, 3 decades on, still there, still growing, that model was proven. So that would be my standout one. The next one would actually be James Cook. Now, I'm slightly biased there because I was the international director at James Cook University for several years. But the reason for that is actually James Cook University's Singapore campus. Now, what's really interesting is that more than a third, in fact, it's nearly 40% now of JCU's total student load is Singaporean students in Singapore. Now, that's an important thing there. They're Singaporean students in Singapore studying at an Australian university. So they are actually technically what we would call domestic students rather than international students. And it's really interesting because as JCU Singapore is growing, it's really focused on the areas where there were skills gaps in Singapore that the large established Singapore universities, NUS, management, money university, etc., weren't actually filling. So that's things such as environmental science, very niche business, public health, more from the applied point of view than the medical point of view, tourism, and aligning education of regional priorities such as climate resilience and sustainability. And one of the interesting things about the JCU Singapore model is the JCU in Singapore is actually registered as a Singaporean university. So it's not an Australian university operating in Singapore. It's actually registered in Singapore as a Singaporean university. So it's not a foreign institution. That, to me, is truly transnational when the maturity of the system gets to that point. Now, for students, that provides amazing outcomes. And a couple of real standout ones are the Bachelor of Finance that the university delivers jointly with the Singapore Stock Exchange that is actually recognised by both the Singapore Stock Exchange and the Australian Stock Exchange. So Singaporean students studying at the JCU campus in Singapore or Australian students studying in Australian campuses have mutual recognition across the 2 stock exchanges. That's phenomenal stuff. And by the way, it also means they can move between the 2 countries and work in both jurisdictions. There's also a moot court for law on campus, or Singapore law, not Australian law. And probably the most standout example there is the recognition of the Bachelor of Psychology. So if you do a Bachelor of Psychology at JCU, at any of its Australian campuses or at the Singapore campus, the professional accreditation bodies in both Singapore and Australia jointly and mutually recognise the qualification. So regardless of where you study at JCU, in Singapore or Australia, you can go and work or be registered and work as a psychologist in both countries. It's fantastic stuff, truly transnational. Probably the next one from the training space, is actually take Queensland's work in the Pacific Islands. probably about 60 to 70% of the total number of students trained in vocational education and training in our Southwest Pacific are actually trained by TAFE Queensland. Now, almost all of that work happens in country, Vanuatu, Solomons, PNG, Fiji, etc. But what's particularly interesting about the TAFE Queensland model, and Carla, you touched on this before about work integrated learning, is in the technical trades, many of those South Pacific-based students get to come to Australia, mostly Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast campuses of TAFE Queensland, and undertake their really intense technical work. So again, very much across border, the students are getting experience in both countries. And one of the really interesting things about the TAFE Queensland program is that's now fully integrated with the Pacific Workers Program. So it actually is providing pathways as well for students and their peers. Back to one that's probably more mass education, but still highly successful, would be the Navitas Global Pathways Partnerships. And that's particularly with groups such as Edith Cowan University in Dubai and Curtin University in Malaysia. Tend to be mass education, business, accounting, finance, general science, general arts, but again, hugely successful. Many, many students have gone through that. Those arrangements have been in place for a couple of decades. And then finally, one that's just a little bit niche is actually Box Hill Institute from Melbourne. So Box Hill Institute is a combined TAFE and higher education provider, all very technical training. Box Hill Institute now have a campus in Kuwait. And at their Kuwait campus, they offer vocational training in the practical skills-based learning in fields like business, IT, and design. And it's a real standout because it adapts the Australian vocational expertise in local work with the local workforce demands in Kuwait. And most of the students who study in those programs in Kuwait, Box Hill Institute of Technology, are actually on programs where they're already assigned to future employers. So it's completely integrated with the employment market. And that's probably about where I'll leave it because there's about 50 examples I can think of, and they're all slightly different, all have their positives and their negatives. But I will say the one thing that really works with all of these and where it really works in general is where the Australian provider is absolutely committed to the presence in country and works with in-country people, their skills, their knowledge and their culture. It's not about just transplanting, if you like, a franchise from Australia into another country. It has to be homegrown and championed.
Yeah, so fantastic examples there, and really it just speaks to that partnership and what that requires to really, really be successful. I mean, I guess being part of a vocational education provider, I always think about what is the job at the end, and to hear for some of those examples that the job is it's the key driving factor for the program and its development, and in those spaces where those skills are really needed it's really amazing to hear, and particularly the examples where it's been happening for many, many, many years. I can only imagine how effective and how embedded those types of programs become after that amount of history.
Absolutely. I could actually just very quickly add to that. When I'm the national director at JCU, with all of that kind of thinking, we like to say that we were selling opportunity, not a piece of paper.
I mean, so much more ultimately, doesn't it? I'm so curious about where technology is also creating opportunity here. I definitely see those borders shifting and becoming a lot different than what they have been as a result of some of the great technology we're now seeing